Today we're speaking with geologist David Montgomery, co-author with Anne Bickley of a new book called What Your Food Ate. Very interesting title. David is professor in the College of the Environment at the University of Washington and earlier had been awarded a MacArthur Fellowship. You may already be familiar with him through his acclaimed book called Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. Dr. Montgomery has long argued that the root of good health begins with dirt, a factor that we ignore at our peril. Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series. I'm Kelly Brownell, professor of public policy at Duke University and director emeritus of the World Food Policy Center at Duke. David, thanks so much for being with us. I'm really grateful you could join us today.
Oh, sure, Kelly. Happy to be here and talk with you about this stuff.
Well, I really admire your work, and this work in this area is so important. We've recorded a number of episodes around the issue of regenerative agriculture, and it's been impressive how much interest there is in this topic, which I think only a few years ago wasn't very well known to most people, but now is becoming more part of the general discussion, which I see as a very positive development. Let's begin with your interest in dirt. So what is the condition of the Earth's dirt?
Well, sad to say, not very good in terms of our agricultural soils in particular. That's something as a geologist, that's what got me interested in soils, is looking at the long history of human interaction with our landscapes and soils. And I ended up writing a history of farming about how it had degraded farmland around the world over the course of centuries. And the short answer is that we've degraded something between about a quarter and a third probably of the world's potentially viable agricultural land to the point where it's not terribly useful for agriculture. And the UN's 2015 Global State of the Soil report concluded we're losing about 1/3% a year of our ability to grow food on this planet due to ongoing soil loss and degradation. So the physical erosion of the soil and the degradation of its fertility as manifest through the loss of soil organic matter. And that 0.3% a year number doesn't sound like a big deal on a year-to-year basis, but think about that over the rest of this century, and it adds up to almost another third of the world's farmland taken out of production at a time when we really need sort of all hands on deck, or all acres on deck, as it may be, to feed the world as our population keeps growing. So we face a fundamental challenge this century of how to sustain agriculture on a degrading resource base. Our other choice is to think about trying to improve and enhance and restore the soil. And that's where regenerative agriculture comes in, and where my interest has really grown beyond just looking at the sad experience of past civilizations that degraded their land, and to think about possible solutions that will allow humanity to continue intensive agriculture to feed the world well into the future.
So what are some of the factors that have driven the erosion and the degradation?
One of the biggest factors that contributed to the loss of topsoil in societies around the world was tillage, the act of plowing. And that seems a little odd to hear at first, because isn't that, something that farmers do? I mean, it helps to provide weed control, it helps to prepare a seed bed for planting, but it also leaves the ground bare and vulnerable to erosion by water and wind until the next plants come in, whether it's a crop or whether it's weeds. And if you leave the ground bare and vulnerable, you get the erosional situation like we saw in the Dust Bowl, where great clouds of dust blew off the American Midwest when we plowed up the plains when the next drought came in. The same kind of thing happened in slower motion in societies in the past, mostly in response to rain rather than wind, but erosion that proceeded faster than the rebuilding of the soil gradually stripped off the topsoil from regions around the world that people depended on to grow their food. And in the modern world, we can actually degrade soil faster with the combination of tillage, the over-application of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which also contribute to a decline in soil organic matter. And the concentration on monocultures can also reduce the release of exudates that plants produce and drip into the soils to feed microbes around their roots. And that combination has all resulted in degradation of soil organic matter and the loss of topsoil, soil erosion, in many parts of the world. And so the very foundation, if you will, of modern conventional agriculture, intensive tillage, lots of agrochemical use, and monocultures, has helped to undermine the native fertility of the farmland that future generations, globally, are going to depend on for their food. So one of the questions I've been wrestling with, and how I got into looking at regenerative agriculture, was how could that process be turned around? How could we actually sustain intensive farming and not degrade the land? Is it possible to actually engage in intensive farming that could improve the health of the world's soils? And that started to turn me into an optimist when I ran into farmers, interviewed farmers and studied their farms where they had indeed done that.
Well, it's impressive to hear those stories. And as I said, we've had a number of such farmers doing podcasts, and it's very inspiring to talk to them. So let's just take one piece of what you said, the use of tillage. So you hear the term no-till farming. What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yes, that would be farming without plowing. And so the challenge is, how do you get the seeds into the ground? How do you prepare a field for planting if you still have the remains of last year's crop on it? The so-called crop residue. And over the last century, people have invented new and different farm implements and machines. And there are no-till planters that can actually put seeds down into the soil in narrow little trenches that get good contact between the seed and the seed bed, but don't require essentially inverting the soil. They don't rip it all up. They just disturb a little narrow slot to actually get seeds in the ground. And what that also allows, keeping the residue from a prior crop as essentially a mulch. If you knock it down, if you kill any weeds that were there physically and knock them down, crimp their stems, you can convert them into mulch that can help keep moisture in the soil, but it also protects the soil from erosion. No-till farming is a way of farming that minimizes the physical disturbance of the soil, and you need different equipment to do it and a different mindset to do it, but it's very feasible to do, and there's lots of different ways to do it. Some farmers use a lot of herbicides to control their weeds in no-till. That's sort of the conventional way to do it, but there's others who are pioneering different techniques that don't require the use of a lot of herbicides to do no-till. Basic idea of no-till is to minimize the disturbance of the soil. And why is that important? Because it enhances the beneficial aspects of soil biology. It allows the soil ecology that really evolved in the last 450 million years since plants colonized the continents. There's all these partnerships that evolved between plants and life in the soil that were mutually beneficial. And if you disturb the soil physically, you disturb a lot of the fungal partners that crops are trying to invest in with some of their early growth.
I know the regenerative agriculture approach wasn't called this going back hundreds of years, but been used by populations around the world, including Native Americans. But if we fast forward today, do you think that this holds promise for being done on a broad enough scale to really make a social difference?
Yeah, I really do. And what's different today is that in the past, these practices of crop rotations and of planting legumes in and amongst crops to get nitrogen into the soil, those are not new ideas. They've been traditional ideas in many societies around the world because they worked to help sustain the fertility of the soil. But what I think we really have the opportunity to do now is to combine some of that ancient wisdom with the modern technology that allows us to do no-till at scale and to minimize our use of not only physical disturbance from adopting no-till, but also to minimize the chemical disturbance that comes with the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides. And combining the modern technology with ancient wisdom can allow us to basically expand the realm of regenerative practices to very large-scale farming, because unless we all want to become farmers, we're not going to be able to do small-scale regenerative farming and feed the world, even though most of the world's population is fed by small-scale farmers. Those of us in the westernized world relying on very few people to feed very many of us. And I've been on regenerative farms that are up to 20,000 acres in the US, big, large, mechanized farms that have done an amazing job at rebuilding the fertility of their land. And I've also been on very small scale subsistence farms in equatorial West Africa that are regenerative, that have done an amazing job at rebuilding the fertility of their land. And those three general principles of minimizing disturbance, growing cover crop, always keeping living roots in the ground to provide exudates to feed the microbes, and to grow a diversity of plants, that recipe is a combination of principles that different kinds of practices would need to be used on, large farms or small farms or high-tech farms and manual labor subsistence farms. But the general underlying philosophy of cultivating the beneficial life in the soil underpins all those. And that's how I tend to look at what I would call regenerative agriculture, are farming practices that are tailored to the size of the farm, the environment, the climate, the crops that farmers want to grow, the technology they have access to, but that prioritizes building the health of the soil as the foundation for the farm.
It's nice to hear such a positive outlook on this. You're painting a picture saying that it can be done. Do you think it can be done in a way that can compete cost-wise with traditional approaches to farming?
Absolutely. And that was a big focus of what I wrote about in Growing a Revolution. If you could tell a farmer that you could cut their fertilizer costs, cut their diesel costs, cut their pesticide costs as much as in half, they all start sort of looking at you like going, yeah, tell me more. How would you do that? And that's one of the key attractions, I think, of regenerative agriculture. Once the soil is restored to a healthier state, you don't need as much fertilizer. You don't need as many pesticides, and you don't drive tractors around as much if you're doing no-till. And what are three of the biggest costs on modern farms in North America? Well, fertilizer, diesel, and pesticide. And so if you can teach farmers a different way of farming that starts with a different way of looking at the soil and adopting a different series of practices that allows them to harvest as much while spending less to do it, it's a recipe for a more profitable farm. And for what I've seen in the experience of the sort of the pioneering regenerative farmers that I've interviewed, once they've restored fertility to their land, their yields are comparable to, if not better than, their conventional neighbors, and their expenses are less. That's what started turning me into an optimist on this, is I've seen a lot of growing interest in farming communities simply because farmers are kind of pushed to the wall and looking for ways to cut costs.
Well, that's so exciting to hear that. And then, of course, at some point, government could subsidize these sort of approaches to make it even more cost effective because of the environmental benefits.
There's all kinds of add-ons in terms of benefits: less off-site nitrogen pollution, greater on-farm biodiversity, enhancements to rural economies, and also differences in what gets into the food that we grow that could potentially benefit human health.
Well, I have a million questions to ask you. We talked about the vitality and health of the soil. Let's talk about the vitality and health of what's being grown in the soil, that is the nutrient quality of the foods. In the book, you note that produce is significantly less nutrient dense than in the past. How much is this true, and how less dense is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one of the things we really delved into in What Your Food Ate, because it's a central question to thinking about, well, does soil health matter to human health? And the conclusion we came away with in diving into the peer-reviewed literature and doing some of food testing of our own was that there's three key areas where the nutrient density, shall we say, of food has suffered over the last half century. And that's in terms of mineral micronutrients, phytochemicals, and the fat profiles of our meat and dairy. So how does that work? Well, in terms of mineral micronutrients, a lot of plants partner with fungal communities in the soil to actually trade sugars and fats and proteins that plants will drip out of their roots to feed microbes in the soil in exchange for those microbes, particularly fungi, to go out and mine things like zinc or copper or iron from the soil and trade it to the plant. It's literally an underground economy, but where both partners benefit from the exchanges. And conventional agricultural practices disturb those relationships. So we're not talking so much about, the major nutrient composition of foods as much as the micronutrients. And plants have different gene pathways where if they're grown in very nitrogen-rich environments, they shut down their exudate production, so they stop feeding their microbial partners, so their microbial partners aren't on the job to give them the mineral micronutrients that they need and that turn out to be very important for our health too when we eat them. And plants also make what are known as phytochemicals in response greatly to environmental stimuli, some of which are microbes in the soil. And so the communities of life around their roots are actually key partners in terms of making things that we don't often consider nutrients in the nutritional sciences, but they're important for maintaining human health. Things like antioxidants, anti-inflammatories. Those are examples of the functions phytochemicals can serve in our bodies. And our farming practices have disrupted them. How much they've disrupted them? There's studies that show differences on the orders of 50 to 100%, others that are more like 20%. Most of the studies and the testing that we did as well make it look like it's more like around 20%-ish. So it's modest but very real differences in these compounds that the medical sciences have shown are fairly beneficial to promoting human health in our diets.
So can I assume from what you're saying that there's research now showing that if you use better soil practices, a la regenerative agriculture, that the nutrient quality improves?
Yeah, it's a non-trivial difference. And the other difference, it's an even bigger difference, is looking at the ratio of the composition of fats in meat and dairy in terms of the omega-6 and omega-3 fats. To make a very simple generalization, omega-6 fats in our bodies are instrumental in initiating inflammation, whereas omega-3 fats are instrumental in quelling or reducing inflammation. And it turns out that what we get in terms of the fat composition of our meat and dairy products very much depends on what the cows ate that produced that meat and dairy. And cows that graze leafy green plants, actually grazing out in a pasture, they eat a lot of omega-3s because that's what's in the leaves of plants, because omega-3s are central to photosynthesis. Omega-6s are very rich in seed sources. They serve different purposes in seeds. And so cattle that are on a feedlot diet of seed-derived feeds are rich in omega-6s. And our diet has gone from having just a few more omega-6s than omega-3s in our diet 100 years ago to now we're awash in omega-6s from that change in our meat and dairy, and also the addition of seed oils to processed foods. And that trade we write about in the book, that translates through, we think, to essentially how so many of us are dealing with chronic maladies that are rooted in chronic inflammation.
Another way to really move this along might be for consumers to begin requesting products that are grown in such a way. And so I'm wondering about your opinion on whether a pull from consumers might help here. Do you think there could come a time when that would be the case?
I absolutely do, in fact. I just noticed in Anna, my own buying habits, that so I started doing this research and learning what it was we did along the way. Our buying habits have changed. So we're buying 100% grass-fed meat and dairy when we can. We've tried to connect with farmers whose practices we really like in terms of the produce we can buy at farmers markets here in Seattle where we live. Now, the average consumer faces a challenge today in terms of, what's labeled as what in a grocery store. But it's our hope that people will start thinking more about these connections, start asking questions, ask the produce manager at your store, what are the farms doing that you're getting the produce from? I could definitely see a world in the not too distant future where consumers may be armed with the ability to know what the analyses of different batches of produce coming in.
And I wonder if the first movement here might not be from institutions, that a school system or a hospital or the procurement part of a city or county government, if they made purchasing decisions based on nutrient quality and, of course, the practices used to grow the food, could make a big difference.
I think it's a tremendous idea that I think could be very impactful. And I think you're right that could be where you might see some of the biggest pieces of movement. There's also been some corporations that have been interested in trying to move towards adopting and advertising that they have adopted regenerative sourcing in some of their ingredients. I really sort of see three areas that need attention in terms of advancing regenerative agriculture. Consumer demand is one, as we've been discussing. The sort of the inherent farmers' incentives in terms of economics that we discussed earlier is another. But the third is in terms of rethinking our agricultural subsidies and policies to actually reward farmers who are rebuilding the health and fertility of their land, who are reinvesting in the future of America, quite literally, instead of continuing to subsidize conventional practices that frankly degrade the fertility of the land and the ability of future generations to feed themselves. If we could get all three of those areas lined up, working sort of towards the same goal of making what we call regenerative agriculture today the conventional agriculture of tomorrow, that could literally change the world in the coming decades. And it's not going to happen fast, but I think it's something that could be done over the course of 2 or 3 decades at a time when we really need the change.
Well, especially if the right research got done at the right time. For example, I could imagine going back to school systems. Let's say that a school system changes its buying practices and ends up buying more nutrient-dense foods and then proves that there are beneficial outcomes for the kids, like better performance in school and more attention and things like that. Then you could see a lot of adopters coming pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would love to see a lot more research along those lines done. We tried to connect the dots in what your food ate, from soil health to crop health to animal health to human health. But there's a lot of space between those dots and a lot of work that needs to be done. But it's a very promising area and a new way to think about those connections.
So could we talk about livestock for another minute? You mentioned this earlier, and it sounds like there's a lot of promise using these techniques for livestock production. Most people think of plant production here, but livestock are really important in this context as well. Are there places where livestock and plant-based agriculture are interacting with each other in this context?
Yeah, some of the farmers I visited were reintegrating animal husbandry into their cropping operations and having their cattle graze off their cover crops and then manure their fields. And I came from a position where I had long thought of cattle in particular as harmful to the land through gully formation and erosion from overgrazing, in other words. And the farmers that I visited who had used cattle to rebuild the fertility of their soils were really grazing in a very different manner, in a different style, enhanced the fertility of their land as a result of reintegrating them. And I think one of the big inadvertent mistakes of 20th century agriculture was essentially separating animal husbandry from cropping and encouraging farmers to specialize in one or the other. And so now we have the sort of the perverse situation where we grow a whole lot of corn using practices that degrade the fertility of the land to feed cattle in feedlots who then are full of omega-6s that degrade our health when we eat them. It makes no sense in terms of large-scale agricultural policy unless you're thinking with a mid-20th century mindset of maximizing efficiency and industrializing and separating those corners of agriculture. But what we inadvertently did is we broke some of the biological and ecological connections that helped keep the land fertile and that were a result of the integration of animal husbandry and cropping practices. And that's another example, I think, of the value of potentially reintegrating some elements of ancient wisdom with modern science to think about doing things a little differently.
Let me end with this question, and I want to see if I'm reading you right. So it sounds like if you look at the world's situation with dirt, agriculture, it's a pretty dire picture, getting worse quickly, and it could go really badly if nothing is done. But it also sounds like you're very optimistic. There's a lot we know about what can be done. A lot of it is being done, and the signs for the future are positive. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I am optimistic about this. I struggle with how much of that optimism is a choice rather than a logical extension of what I know. But I think we know enough now about techniques that can rebuild fertility of the land and restore it that it's feasible to see a path forward where we could do that at scale with very positive results. That could also put a lot of carbon back in the world's agricultural soils, which would have ancillary climate benefits. It's not going to solve the climate problem. That's a fossil fuel issue primarily, but it could help. Back when I wrote Dirt in 2007, I think it was, there was hardly anybody talking about soil health and the long-term importance of reinvesting in the world's agricultural soils to rebuild their fertility. And now almost every farming conference I go to or get invited to speak at, that's one of the big topics of discussion among farmers. And there's now discussion at policy level in terms of the new farm bill. Climate activists are interested in. There's a lot of very broad, I think, public support and interest coalescing around the idea that one of the smartest things we could do for the future of our own species and for the health of the planet is to reinvest in the health and the fertility of our agricultural soils.
So, David, we've done several hundred of these podcasts, and I have to say this is one of the most inspiring. It's really nice to hear how optimistic you are, but you also have a real gift for taking what are pretty complicated topics and making them very accessible, understandable, and engaging. So I really appreciate you being with us today. Thanks so much.
Kelly, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Our guest today has been Dr. David Montgomery of the University of Washington. His new book with Ann Bickley, What Your Food Ate, is available online. And thank you for listening. If you'd like to subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Podcasts and transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center. This is Kelly Brownell.